Hello, everyone. It's April 8th, 2021, and you're listening to the Fights We Love podcast. I'm your host, Alex O, and today we're going to be talking about Sodiq Yusuff versus Arnold Allen, the co main event of this weekend's Fight Night card. In this episode, we'll talk a little bit about MMA news, then we'll get into the state of the featherweight division. After that, I'll give a quick overview of this weekend's fight, and in the main event, we'll talk about the offensive and defensive tendencies of both Sodiq Yusuff and Arnold Allen. After that, we'll take a look at how the fight might play out and then wrap up with a quick peek at the rest of the card. This is the fight that I'm looking forward to the most on this weekend's card. Lots of great details to get into with both of these two rising prospects. So, thank you for tuning in this week, and let's get to it. Anything good happened since the last episode? Well, Nate Diaz versus Leon Edwards, that was announced. That's been added to UFC 262 as the first 5-round co-main event in UFC history. So that's going to be a really exciting fight to watch out for. UFC 262 in general, that's looking like a solid card. We've also got the lightweight title between Charles Oliveira and Michael Chandler in the main event. So I'm loving the way that card is shaping up right now. For heavyweight, UFC looks like they're moving on from Ngannou Jones. At least that's what they're saying. They're exploring the Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis rematch. So we'll see what happens there. I mean, this whole saga has been pretty interesting to say about the UFC and John Jones and not being able to negotiate a fair price for him. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think we can all agree that Ngannou Jones is probably the most exciting fight they can make right now, and we just want to see them put it together and get Jones fairly compensated for. He's like, if, in my opinion, he's been a really consistent pay-per-view draw for about a decade now. So I think he does deserve his money. And also, if I was gonna fight Ngannou, give me money to fight Ngannou. Nobody should be fighting Ngannou for anything less than $1 million right now, if you ask me. That man may change your life. Demetrius Johnson, we saw last night, knocked out by Adriano Moraes in ONE FC, and Moraes caught him with an uppercut as he entered to exchange, and then followed up with some hard shots on the ground. And as Demetrius Johnson tried to get up, Moraes landed a hard knee, and it was in the UFC rules, it would be considered a grounded knee. So I've seen a few controversial takes on it already, but the reality is the rule set in ONE FC is similar to the rules that were in Pride back in the day. So you are allowed to knee a grounded opponent. So that's something you need to be aware of and something you need to be on the lookout for. But Demetrius Johnson was hurt, and so the grounded knee follow-up, that's just tough. It's always tough to see that. But for Adriano Moraes, wow, that's a huge win for him. So, be on the lookout for that. Other than that, Dana White posted a picture with Floyd Mayweather and Nobuyuki Sakakibara with the caption, "What is going on?" So I guess we can expect something crazy there in the next couple weeks. And I don't know, crazier than a fight between Floyd Mayweather and a YouTuber. We'll see. But that's all I got for this week, and I don't want to spend too much time on the gossip of the MMA world. But let's move on to the state of the featherweight division. Now, Alexander Volkanovski, he looks to be recovering from COVID now. He made a post on social media earlier this week, and he was talking about his experience with COVID, and it sounds like it really kicked his ass. So I'm glad to see that he's on the path to recovery and getting healthy again. And hopefully we'll see when they schedule that fight with Brian Ortega soon. The number one ranked contender and former champion Max Holloway, he's fresh off probably the most impressive 5-round decision win we've ever seen, and he beat Calvin Kattar, who's ranked at number 6 now. So not sure what we're gonna do with Max yet. It really feels like we're gonna have to wait and see what happens with the Ortega Volkanovski fight first. So yeah, number 2 ranked Brian Ortega. He's set to face Volkanovski again. No date is scheduled yet, and that takes us to number 3, Zabit Magomed Sharipov. He was previously scheduled to fight Yair Rodriguez, so number 3 versus number 4, and Rodriguez pulled out with an ankle injury, and then he received a suspension for missing a drug test. So there's been no replacement made for Zabit yet. Yair Rodriguez became eligible for return on March 8th this year, but we haven't really seen if the UFC wants to try making that fight with Zabit one more time. I mean, at this point, that fight is looking like the new Khabib versus Ferguson fight, which was canceled 4 times, and I mean, I think we're up to like 3 or 4 now with Zabit and Yair. And I mean, after the fight was scrapped this time, Zabit was talking about how he just wants to wait for a title shot. So we're not really sure what we'll see there. A little bit messy situation. At number 5, we have Chan Sung Jung, the Korean Zombie. He's coming off of his loss with Brian Ortega, and it was recently announced that he's going to be fighting Dan Ige next, and Dan Ige is fresh off that first-round win over Gavin Tucker, so great fight there. I'm really excited for that one. And then at number 6, Calvin Kattar, and number 7, Josh Emmett. Neither guys really has a fight scheduled yet. Kattar is likely going to take some time to recover after that Holloway fight. He took a lot of damage and a lot of head trauma in the fight with Max. And Josh Emmett, it sounds like he's recovering from an ACL tear. So, wish the best of recovery to both of those guys. Hope it goes well. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like featherweight is set to get rolling with some pretty solid matchups in the top 10. Korean Zombie versus Dan Ige, that's definitely a hell of a fight. And Dan Ige, first round win like that's very impressive. And then Korean Zombie, we're not really sure, but he's actually he's been wanting to get a 3-round fight. So I don't know if they're going to be doing that as a main event or a 3-round fight. But yeah, definitely a good fight against the top 10 contender. And yeah, I'm not really sure what's going to happen with the title picture after Volkanovski Ortega. That fight being postponed kind of throws a bit of a wrench into the title picture, just because if Volk wins that fight and retains the belt, we're not really sure how motivated the UFC would be to do a fight with Max a 3rd time. And if Ortega wins a belt, the rematch with Max is kind of a no-brainer. So we're kind of just sitting and waiting until that fight goes through. Meanwhile, Zabit is kind of on the sidelines waiting for a title shot too. So we might see the UFC try to, entice him into a fight with Max Holloway for, setting up a number 1 contender match. But there's a few things we can do here, and I think we're kind of stuck waiting until Volkanovski Ortega is rescheduled, and then we'll have a better idea. Which brings us to this weekend's fight, which is the number 11 ranked Super Sodiq Yusuff versus the number 10 ranked Arnold Almighty Allen. And both of these guys, like I mentioned, they are really solid up and coming prospects. Both of them, cracking into the top 10 now. And I love this matchup. So let's start with Sodiq Yusuff. He's 27 years old. Fights out of Camp Springs in Maryland, and he trains with Team Lloyd Irvin. He is 11-1 overall. He won his UFC contract on the Dana White Contender Series, and since then he has gone 4-0 in the UFC, 2 knockout/TKO wins, and 1 performance of the night bonus. He's 5'9", 71-inch reach, and he fights out of an orthodox stance. For Arnold Allen, he is number 10 in the featherweight division, 27 years old. He fights out of Felixstowe, Suffolk, England, and he trains out of TriStar Gym in Canada. That's with Faraz Zahabi as the head coach. He is 16-1 overall, 7-0 in the UFC with 2 submission wins and 1 performance of the night bonus. He's also 5'8" with a 70-inch reach advantage. Reach. Why do I always do that? And he fights out of the southpaw stance. So, very interesting fight in the featherweight division here. Both men undefeated in their UFC runs, both men on track to become title contenders. And this almost feels like Jones Bader from back in the day, where we just have these two really solid up and coming prospects finally meeting. I mean, there's no really real relation here in the styles between Jones Bader and Yusuff versus Allen, but either way, the idea that you have these, two really hot prospects meeting early on, and you think there could be title implications there later. That's what I see here, and I really love this matchup. So, Sodiq Yusuff, he's been on this explosive tear since entering the UFC through the Contender Series, and Arnold Allen, he's shown a lot of scrappiness, a lot of toughness, a lot of grit, and he's got a couple third round come from behind finishes under his belt. So both men fought last January 2020, pre-pandemic. So now they meet with a little over a year layoff for both of them. And with the year layoff, we can't really know exactly how they're going to look, since that's a good amount of time to grow and work on technique, add some new tools. But we're going to look back at some tendencies from the previous fight and talk about what to look out for this weekend. So let's start with Sodiq Yusuff. Now, Sodiq Yusuff, to state the obvious, he's a dangerous and explosive striker. He's had the speed and power advantage in every fight I've seen him in so far. For the most part, he likes to pressure forward. He likes to keep his opponents on the back foot, but he's also capable of adjusting if his opponent starts landing. And if his opponent starts seeing success with their shots, he'll actually switch to moving around the outside and start trying to draw his opponents into his counters. Offensively, before we get into any of the specific techniques, I want to talk about his hand fighting first. So his hand fighting, Yusuff actually builds a lot of his game out from the hand fight, both offensively and defensively. Typically, we see him use his rear hand to hand fight. When he's matched up with another orthodox fighter, he'll keep his lead hand up, defending his chin, and then reach his right hand forward. And this allows him to keep his opponent's jab at bay when his opponent is also standing orthodox. But that won't be much of a factor in this fight. The important thing to keep in mind is that this is an orthodox versus southpaw matchup. Yusuff as orthodox, Allen as southpaw. So the lead hand fight will play a much larger role here. He can still go for that rear hand, the rear hand fight and the rear hand trap if he wants to, but I just don't really see him reaching for that as much, just because reaching that rear hand forward, that's going to leave him vulnerable to the left hook, and that's Allen's power hand. So you don't really want to leave openings for the power hand there. Instead, like I said, he's going to have to use his lead hand to fight and trap against Allen's lead hand. And that's a very common thing that we see in these southpaw orthodox matchups. It's the lead hand fight to see who can gain better positioning with their hands to get their jabs going, and the lead leg fight, who can get their lead leg outside of the other fighter's lead leg. And that will line up your rear hand on the center line and make your straight shots a little bit easier to land. When Yusuff utilizes a hand fight, he's looking to do two things primarily. First is to parry his opponent's incoming punches. He wants to stifle these shots as they're coming in, especially straight shots. And also he wants to land the calf kick. Occasionally he tries to trap his opponent's lead hand down. He'll trap it by pushing it down or holding it down and then sneak his punch over the top of it. But for the most part, his hand fight acts as a distraction for his calf kick. If you look back at his Contender Series fight with Mike Davis, at about 4:18 of round one, we see Sodiq reaching his hand forward to trap Davis's lead hand, and he grabs that hand and throws a straight right. A second later, he reaches the right hand forward again, and then he lands a hard calf kick while Davis is preoccupied with the hand fight. And this works against both southpaw and orthodox opponents. So Mike Davis was orthodox here, but against Gabriel Benitez, who was standing southpaw against him, if you look at 3:10 of round one of that fight, we see Sodiq reaching forward with his left hand, grabbing at Benitez's lead hand, and then Benitez throws the straight left, and Sodiq throws the right low kick as Benitez looks for the straight left. So in both cases, he's occupying his opponent's hands up top, and while they're distracted, he goes low. And this worked so effectively in the Davis fight that by the time the third round came around, Davis could barely stand on his left leg. And so he would have to switch to southpaw anytime Yusuff started throwing that kick again in the third round. And there's also tons of examples in Sadiq's fight with Shaman Moraes. And I'll try to post some examples on Twitter, but he did a great job of just constantly hand fighting and throwing that calf kick under the hand fight. Another big cornerstone of his striking is his jab. He's got a beautiful jab. It's lightning quick, explosive. He leans a little bit heavy on the lead leg to land it, but he doesn't really overextend with it. So he's usually very controlled with it. He pressures forward and uses the jab to back his opponents up as he's moving forward. And it's probably what he uses the most out of every strike. And this is why another reason why that lead hand fight is so important, because the nature of the southpaw orthodox matchup, it causes both fighters' lead hands to constantly be in contact with each other, and it gets in the way of each other's jabs. So if he doesn't really win that lead hand fight, he's going to have a hard time landing his jab going, and he'll have to look at other ways to score without being able to use the jab to set things up. In his fight with Gabriel Benitez, if you look at 235 of round 1, you can see Sodiq, he reaches his left hand forward and he pulls Benitez's right hand down in a hand trap and lands the jab over it. So he is capable of hand trapping and using the lead hand to set up his jab, and I would expect to see him go for this a lot against Arnold Allen. The jab is really Sadiq's main weapon of choice, and what he really wants to do is get you jabbing with him or jabbing at the same time as him. Because if you and him jab at the same time, he's likely going to beat you to the punch, or if you and him land at the same time, he's going to land harder. His fight with Andre Fili is just littered with tons of examples with this. If you look at 4:11 of round 1, you see Fili moving around the outer cage with Yusuff coming forward and pressuring. Yusuff and Fili, they jab at the same time, and Yusuff lands first. Then a few seconds later at 4:08, they jab at the same time again, and this time Yusuff beats Fili to the punch and lands significantly harder. He really snaps Fili's head back there. And so what we're seeing is a distinct advantage in terms of speed and power here. And if you and Yusuff are planted in your stance and throwing at the same time, he's going to win that exchange more often than not. And he's not come up against a more dangerous puncher in that regard yet. Fili's corner actually instructed him to stop jabbing with Sodiq after that round. And later on in the fight, Fili actually switched to southpaw to try to take the jab out of the equation entirely. So that scenario that I mentioned, that won't be as available in the stance matchup with Arnold Allen, where he can just score by jabbing at the same time. But the principle is the same, because he wants you to jab with him and he wants you to trade jabs back and forth with him. Because if he can start drawing out your jabs in response to his, that opens things up for what he really wants, which is the counter right hook. And the right hook, that's where Yusuff, he does the most damage, and he relies mostly on hook combinations, throwing either a 3-4 or a 4-3, left, right, or right, left hook combinations. And I haven't really seen him stray away from that. Frankly, he hasn't really needed to, just because it's been so effective for him on his current run. When it comes to countering, his plan is fairly straightforward. So if you're standing orthodox against him, he's going to look for the counter right hook. But if you're standing southpaw to him, he's also going to look for the counter right hook. So there's a little more to it than that, but that's the core of his counter game. He likes to slip inside or outside of incoming straight shots and wing right hooks over your hand. And that's worked great for him on his current run. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's just been highly effective for him. Now, we mentioned in the Fili fight, Yusuff was finding a lot of success with the jab early on. So Fili switched to southpaw and started looking for the straight left to land against Sodiq. And that actually worked really well for Fili at first. He was leading combinations with these short straight lefts, and he was landing pretty consistently. Then Yusuff got a read on that straight left hand, and then he started taking over the round again. So at 3:19 of round 3, you see Fili standing southpaw, and he leads with a straight left, and Yusuff slips inside and he lands the counter right hook over Fili's left hand. And again, this happens at 2:46 of round 3, and again at 2:19 of round 3. Fili tries to lead with a straight left again. Yusuff slips inside and swings his big counter right over Fili's left hand, and he lands clean just about every time there. This plays out almost identically to the Gabriel Benitez fight. So Benitez was seeing short success, straight lefts, short 1-2s from southpaw, and he actually drops Sodiq at 221 of round 1 with a short 1-2. And Yusuff, he recovers, then he adjusts, and this is what I mean by, up until that point in the fight, Sodiq was the one walking forward. He was the one pressuring. Benitez drops him, and then Yusuff changes his stance, not his stance. He changes his plan. He moves to the outside of the cage, and he starts walking around the outside. And Benitez feeling, he's pretty confident that he got that knockdown, and he's walking forward, and he starts trying to lead with the left. And Yusuff wanted to draw that left out because now he knows what he's looking for and looking to counter. So at 52 seconds, what happened? Well, you guessed it. Sodiq Yusuff slips inside and he lands a hard right hook that over Benitez's left hand, and that drops Benitez, and Sodiq follows up with hard ground and pound for the finish. So the straight left, yes, it's an effective tool against Yusuff, especially if you keep it sharp, you keep it short. You can't find yourself overextending on it. So yes, the straight left is, of course, an effective tool against Yusuff, as it is in all southpaw orthodox matchups. But the key here is that you need to keep changing things up so that Yusuff can't get a read on it and start bombing you with that right hand every time you step in with your left. He's going to catch you over the top of that left hand. Now, some of Fili's best shots came when he feinted first and then through the left. At 4:23 of round 3, you see Fili, he hip thrusts first to feint a southpaw left kick, and Yusuff, we see him bite on the feint, reaches his hands out to parry, and Fili slips a straight left down the pipe. And then again at 1:56 of round 3, Fili, he uses that hip thrust feint and then lands a straight left before Yusuff can even slip inside and throw the counter right. So the hip feint, that's enough to get Yusuff hesitating for a split second, and that gives Fili enough time to land and then get out and avoid the counter. So that will be a really important thing to watch for against Arnold Allen. If he has success early on with the straight left, that's great. But if he keeps going to the same entrances and the same angles and he doesn't really change it up, then you can count on Sodiq getting a read on that and start landing his right hand. Now, defensively, we talked about Sodiq's hand fighting. He likes to reach his hand forward and parry and deflect shots when they come in from striking range. This is plenty effective against straight shots, but as we mentioned in the breakdown with Miocic and Ngannou too, reaching for parries leaves you vulnerable to eating hooks. This also becomes a problem if your opponent is good at feinting, like we just mentioned with Fili. Fili was able to land the straight left by feinting his hips first and get Yusuff reaching. And you don't have to feint your hips, but we even saw earlier in the first round, Fili was able to land his left hook from orthodox just by feinting the jab out and swinging the left hook around Yusuff's lead hand when he would reach his hand forward to parry. Around Yusuff's rear hand when he reached it forward to parry. So the idea here is that you want to use your feints to draw out these hand parries and get Yusuff reaching forward, and that will create openings for your follow-up shots around the hands. Whether he reaches forward with the rear or reaches forward with the lead hand, there's going to be an opening if you can force him to stick that hand out there. Now, if his opponent is able to get into close range with him, he'll switch to a high elbow guard. You've probably seen Dustin Poirier most notably use this. And it's actually also something that Floyd Mayweather likes to do from his Philly shell. So with a high elbow guard, you would have your rear hand up. Let's say you're standing orthodox. You have your rear hand up by your chin, and your lead arm is pointing your elbow straight ahead at your opponent with your shoulder up by your chin. So it's similar to a Philly shell, but instead of your elbow down and your arm across your stomach, your elbow is up and pointed straight ahead. And this is really good for blocking punches. If you remember back to Dustin Poirier versus Max Holloway 2, you'll hear Max talking to his corner. He's saying that he's having a hard time landing because Dustin is blocking weird. And that's because the lead elbow of Dustin, it was deflecting and disrupting all of Max's boxing combinations. So it's a really frustrating thing to be trying to come in with straight shots and try to come in with hooks, and you just keep landing on that lead elbow. That being said, with the elbow being high up, this can leave the body open. We saw Sheymon Moraes. He saw a lot of success landing to Yusuff's body by just throwing a little quick slap hook up top and then going straight to to the body with it. He would slap up top and go straight right hand to the body. And so you can occupy his guard up top, and with that elbow being high up, that just leaves a lot of open space to land some good shots. So I would expect in Arnold Allen's camp, they have to be looking at ways to keep Sodiq's hands occupied up top, just so that they can open up, tons of real estate on the body there for landing. So looking for ways to land body kicks, looking for ways to land uppercuts or body hooks down there. It has to start with occupying his guard up top, though. As far as his wrestling and his clinch work, that might be the area for most improvement in his game that he needs. I haven't seen much in the clinch from him, both offensively and defensively. Most of the time when he ends up in the clinch, that position tends to stall out and the ref will separate him and his opponent. Although I have seen him a couple times go for that Kimura grip if his opponent has his back against the fence. He did this against Andre Feely. He did this against Mike Davis. And he against Feely, he actually turned Feely off the cage and turned that into a takedown and almost got the Kimura. So that'll be a good thing to look out for if this fight does end up in the clinch. As for his takedown defense, it seemed like Feely was actually able to take him down almost at will. So Yusuff, because he likes to jab so much and he likes to use his head movement, he leans heavy on his lead leg, and that makes it hard to sprawl effectively when your opponent shoots in, especially if they time their shot as you jab. So if you stand up and you just try bobbing, weaving a little bit, you can feel how heavy you are on your front leg. And like we mentioned, Sodiq really likes to slip inside or slip outside of his opponent's incoming punches and wing the right hook. So if you can get him slipping, you can shoot in on his legs, or if you can time it with when he steps in with his jab, you can shoot in on his legs. And anytime he's heavy on that lead leg, it's just so hard to actually sprawl effectively. So if I'm in Arnold Allen's camp, I'm probably going to be looking at opportunities to get this fight against the fence or on the ground to try and make him grapple and hopefully slow down some of that explosive speed and take some pop out of his punches. And that brings us to Arnold Allen. Now, Arnold Allen is an interesting case to me because he entered the UFC back in 2015. He fought once that year, fought once in 2016, once in 2017, and once in 2018. Then he fought twice in 2019 and once in 2020. So not a ton of activity considering how long he's been in the UFC. And that's not because he hasn't wanted to be in there. There have been injuries. Both him and his opponents have had injuries, and he's also had some visa issues. So it's just interesting how he's ended up. But that's also not the worst thing considering that's 6 years to develop while he's been in the UFC. And the reason I bring this up is because he's looked a little bit different in each fight I've seen him in. Against Makwan Amirkhani, he had some really good scrambles. He looked comfortable grappling off of his back and working his own takedowns and getting into his own top game. And then against Mads Burnell, he got soundly out-wrestled, but then he locked in a submission in the last 2 minutes of the fight for a comeback win. And against Gilbert Melendez, he showed a lot of straight lefts, good body shots, left roundhouse kicks. And then against Nick Lentz, he jabbed most of the fight and he didn't throw many kicks at all. So we're seeing different things, different pieces of his game in each fight. And I don't mean that as a knock on him. That means he's had some great experiences and he's been through some tough fights and he's had to come with different game plans for each fights. And so again, I don't mean this as a knock on him. He's 7-0 in the UFC after all. I just had a little bit of a hard time getting a read on him, and I can't say exactly what we're going to see out of him this weekend. I'm just going to try to go over some consistent tendencies. Now, what is most consistent in all of his fights is his hand speed. He's got a really quick jab that just snaps out there. And I think his jab is really at its best when he starts doubling up on it. If you look at his fight with Nick Lentz at 132 of round 2, we see him throw a couple jabs out there and it keeps Lentz at bay. And then as Nick Lentz reaches forward, Allen double jabs and swings a left hook over Lentz's lead hand, and he lands really hard. And later on at 255 of round 3, again, Lentz, he throws a southpaw left head kick and then tries to follow up with a low kick, and Allen double jabs to close the distance and lands another hard left hook. So he sets up his left hook really nicely with that double jab. Another thing he does well is he throws that short straight left, and this is going to be key here, right? So against Gilbert Melendez, his hands look great. And that's probably the best his hands have looked in his current UFC run. At 353 of round one, we see Allen land a straight left as Gilbert winds up for a right hook. And again, at 338 of round one, Allen lands a straight left while Gilbert's trying to throw that right hook. So if he can beat Sodiq Yusuff to the punch with his straight left, that's going to be huge here. And, Sodiq Yusuff, he throws this really hard and explosive right hook, but there's a bit of a windup there and there's a little bit of a telegraph there. So if you can get a read on that and try to beat him to the punch, straight shots always beat hooks. Just because, if you remember like your third grade geometry lesson, going from point A to point B in the straight line is always fastest, right? So the question is, can Arnold land and get out of range before Yusuff and land the right hook? And can Arnold find different ways to land it so he doesn't end up eating that counter right? He also showed some nice body work against Melendez to get some good high-low combinations going. If you look at 2:30 of round one, we see Allen lead with a left uppercut to the body and then follow immediately with a right hook to the head. And then later on at 45 seconds, he lands that left uppercut to the body again. So this should be another key strike to look out for because, as we said about Yusuff's high elbow guard, that body tends to be left open. So if he can land left hooks to the body, land left uppercuts to the body, he can start drawing those hands down and then maybe get that double jab going and land the left hook up top. So you have to try to create your own openings in the guard, and that starts by looking at what openings are there first, exploiting that, and as your opponent tries to adjust, you move to the next open spot. Now, something I really liked that he did in the Melendez fight was that he kept going to the left high kick, and he would lead with the left hand, or he would finish a combination, wait a beat, and then follow with the left high kick, or he would just throw the left high kick naked so he could keep that constantly going, and he threw that consistently throughout the fight. And Frost was giving really strict corner advice. Frost Zahabi is the head coach at TriStar Gym, and so he was giving strict corner advice to not only throw the kick as Melendez backed up, but also throw it from an angle as he's backing up. So he didn't want Arnold Allen just standing in front of him and throwing that kick naked. He wanted to either do some work to get Melendez backing up or circling away, and so he can throw that kick as he's backing up and land on him from a good angle and a safe angle. That's what he emphasized, safe angles. So this keeps Melendez on high alert, but also it forces him to keep his hands high. And Allen wanted his hands high to open up the body so that when it came to the end of round two, you see at 14 seconds, Allen instead throws a left roundhouse kick to the body and he lands clean. So when it comes to somebody like Sodiq, who likes to use that high elbow guard, that left kick could play a big role in doing damage both to the body and to the head. We've talked previously about Derek Brunson versus Jacare 2 and how blocking kicks, it needs to be done with both hands, because if you can catch your opponent blocking a head kick with only one hand up, you're still entirely capable of knocking somebody out like that. Now, if Arnold Allen, he's able to find his range and start landing head kicks on Yusuff's guard, he will have to come out of that high elbow guard to block with two hands, and in that will create openings for his boxing combinations, because you like I mentioned with that high elbow guard, you have your lead hand up and your rear hand is up by your chin, and you really want to make sure you're catching these kicks on both of your forearms, and you don't want to get caught on one hand. Now, as far as his wrestling goes and his clinch work, we don't often find Allen shooting for the takedown, but when he has his opponent pressed up against the fence, he does like this little outside trip takedown. So against Makwan Amirkhani at 3 minutes of round one, we see Allen has Makwan pressed up against the fence, and he uses his right leg as a hook, and he pulls Makwan's left leg out and lands the takedown. We actually looked at how Volkanovski does this effectively in last week's film study. Now, Arnold Allen, he actually pushes off the fence too when he does this. So I think he does that maybe to get more leverage. But either way, if he's got somebody push up against the fence, you'll see him take his right leg and just drag that left leg out and then try to use that to trip them and get that takedown from the over-under or body lock position. Later on in that fight at 238, Allen actually lands a nice judo throw on Makwan from the clinch. So Makwan is, in this case, he's the one pressing Arnold Allen against the fence, and Makwan has both double underhooks in, and Arnold steps his right leg through. He grabs the overhook with his right arm, and he flips Makwan over his right leg, and he reverses that position and lands on top. Really nice judo throw. We see UFC fighters. That's probably the most common judo throw that we see in the UFC. It's pretty effective for when your opponent actually has an advantageous position with his hooks on you. And Makwan, he's pushing him against the fence. He's got his double underhooks. He's starting to work towards the back, and Arnold Allen, he just is able to completely reverse that by getting this judo throw in. And so I've seen him do that a couple times in his other fights too, and that's a nice thing to see in the clinch. So possibly a slight advantage in the clinch, but it's hard to say. That being said, if I was in Arnold Allen's camp, I would want to take my chances in the clinch early on and test Yusuff's cardio. But then again, I suggest the clinch anytime somebody goes up against a power puncher. So, what do I know? Defensively, now I found it a little bit concerning how often I saw Allen get hit by the right hook, both against orthodox and southpaw opponents. Against Makwan Amirkhani, just about every time he stepped in with the jab, Makwan looked for the check right hook, and Makwan was standing southpaw. So they traded shots like that all night, where Arnold Allen would step in with a quick right jab. Makwan would look to parry the jab and swing his right hook, and he made good contact several times. Against Nick Lentz, it was actually even more concerning because Nick Lentz was standing orthodox. So right off the bat at 4:54 of round one, you see Arnold step in with a jab, and Lentz slips outside of Arnold's jab and swings over the jab and lands a counter right hook. We see this happen again at 4:04 and also at 1:31 of round one. Every time Arnold steps in with a jab, Lentz looks to slip outside of the jab and land a right hook. So I would expect to see this type of exchange in this same sequence a lot against Sodiq, who's going to be looking for ways to slip both inside and outside. Now, if Arnold steps in with the jab, I think we're going to see Sodiq slip outside of the jab and swing the right hook. And if Arnold steps in with a straight left, Sodiq will slip inside of the straight left and swing the right hook over the top. So you're going to have to be very aware of that right hook, and you have to be extremely careful with your jabs and straight lefts against Sodiq, who's got that right hook counter on a hair trigger. He's just watching and waiting and jabbing at you, and as soon as you start to try to come back with your own jab, that's when he's got you right where he wants you. So hit and run. You can't overcommit to your jab here. Now, as far as Allen's footwork goes, for the most part, Arnold's footwork is his defense. You'll see him step into range and then hop step backwards. He does this little hop step backwards constantly, and this kind of helps him control the distance, and it also helps him escape quickly if his opponent pressures him forward. So oftentimes, Arnold will opt to get out of range and circle away rather than shell up in the pocket. This is great for avoiding damage, but you have to keep in mind that when you step out of range, you can't really land anything either. So there has to be a kind of pulling effect to draw your opponents into range as you back up. When you look at the fight with Nick Lentz again at 49 seconds of round one, this is a great example where we see Arnold, he's circling left out of range, and he then leads with a straight left as Lentz follows him into striking range. And in this case, Allen lands a straight left before Lentz can slip and counter with his right hook. So this is a kind of hit and run tactic that Allen will need to use if he wants to land safely against Yusuff. Like we said, Yusuff likes to slip and rip, but he cannot do so without planting his feet first, right? I talked about you need to be heavy on your lead leg if you're going to use your head movement. So this is where the pull effect comes in by Arnold using that hop step backwards and also sliding backwards out of range and trying to land as Sodiq follows him in, which we've also seen Sodiq have trouble with in in the past. So if you stand in striking range and just try to trade shots with him, you're dead in the water. He's gonna outstrike you. You're outmanned and outgunned in that regard. But if you move backwards and get Sodiq walking forwards and throw your straight shot as he's walking in, that's your opportunity to land, because he hasn't been able to plant his feet yet. He's still walking forward, and he can't effectively avoid the shot, and he can't effectively throw a counter back. We also see Arnold Allen stretch his arms out and he pushes off his opponent if he gets caught in range. We've seen Amanda Nunes do this a lot too. It almost looks a little bit like he's flailing when you're bouncing punches off of his outstretched arms, but it is effective at deflecting shots as they come in. You're just still vulnerable to shots under or over the arms when you try to push off like this, though. So he's got a good foundation defensively, I think, to deal with Sodiq Yusuff's offense. And again, it's really going to be about the footwork battle here. If he can really effectively circle away and get Sodiq Yusuff following him, or if he ends up moving around the outside and Sodiq cuts the cage effectively against him, then that could also be a short night for him. So footwork battle is key here. Getting his lead leg outside of Sodiq Yusuff's lead leg as Sodiq follows him into range, that'll be something to look out for. So pay very close attention to the lead hand fight and the lead leg battle and how well Arnold is able to draw Yusuff onto his shots. So to close out, how do we see this fight going? Well, I think we'll see the fight remain standing for the most part. Neither guy really seems to grapple unless they need to. I expect to see Sodiq being the one pressuring forward and Allen moving around the outside. And from there, like I said, is going to be a battle for lead hand and foot positioning. Now, with Yusuff being the harder hitter, Allen will need to be the one being careful as he steps into range. If he gets careless with his shots, careless with his jab, or if he goes to the same entrances with his straight left too often, I'm not going to be surprised if he gets caught. You have to change it up, and you have to effectively feint and do something to get Sodiq hesitating before he swings his counter. The best way to take advantage of somebody who's got their counter on a hair trigger is to effectively feint. Now for Arnold, I'm going to emphasize this again, hit and run. I can't imagine Firas Zahabi is looking at the tape on Sodiq Yusuff and he's going to let Arnold Allen stand in front of Yusuff and try to trade big shots and just get bombed on like everybody else has. I think Allen is going to come in and try to be the quicker fighter and really try to frustrate Sodiq and try to get him chasing him around the cage instead of being somebody that's just content to stand in striking range with him. And so really, really emphasize that pull effect. And Dominic Cruz talks about the push and pull of a fight all the time. It's all about range and controlling range. And we see that Arnold Allen is just so good at controlling range by, entering range, hopping backwards, sliding away. So the way he circles and the way he moves out of range and gets Sodiq to come into range, that's going to be the key here. And pull him into range so that he can land the straight left as Sodiq enters range and land that straight left before Sodiq can have time to react and throw his counter right. And I'd also actually I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Arnold try to lead some grappling exchanges. This is the same camp that came up with GSP's dominant game plan in that rematch against BJ Penn, which was grapple early. And they were worried about BJ Penn being the quicker fighter, and he had the faster hands in that fight. And in this case, Yusuff, he has some really fast punches, and he's also the more powerful punches. And so anytime you can get a power puncher grappling and pushing off and using their arms a lot in the clinch or in wrestling exchanges, that's going to slow them down, and that's going to fill their arms with blood and make the arms heavier and make it harder to throw these big power punches with. So this is the same camp that originated that game plan, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a similar game plan out of them early on. Now for Sodiq Yusuff, right hand all day. That's gonna be there at some points in the fight, and he's gonna just wait for Allen to step in with the jab, and Old Faithful, that right hook is going to get the job done for him. And he's going to find ways to slip inside or outside and land that right hook. And also, calf kicking out of the hand fight, that's going to be a big thing here. So we're going to see a lot of lead hand fighting, and we're going to see Sodiq look for that calf kick early on, and he's going to go to it early and often. With that year layoff, I'm going to hope to see some new exchanges, new techniques out of him too. Also, Allen also likes to duck his head as he's pushing away and getting out of exchanges. So if Sodiq can close the distance, get Allen pushing off, there's going to be uppercut opportunities for him there too. So lots of good stuff to look out for this weekend. Really great fight in the featherweight division and great clash of styles. And I really do see this as hit and run versus plant and throw. So I'm really excited to see how things shake out here. This fight takes place this Saturday, April 10th. In Las Vegas at the UFC Apex facility. Now, this is an early card, so the main card is starting at 12 p.m. Pacific time, and the prelims are starting at 9 a.m. Pacific time. Also on the card, we have the main event. We have Marvin Vettori versus Kevin Holland. Kevin Holland is stepping in on short notice after Darren Till injured his collarbone last week, and just again, that's showing how game Kevin Holland is. He just fought a couple weeks ago against Derek Brunson, and he's ready to go again. So however you feel about Kevin Holland, you can't deny that guy's a gamer, and he's ready to fight wherever, whenever. We also have Nina Ansaroff. She's number 5 ranked against the number 11 ranked Mackenzie Dern at women's strawweight. So I'm really excited to see if Mackenzie Dern, this is a tough fight for both women, and Mackenzie Dern, we're going to see if she's ready to make that title run. We also have Julian Marquez fighting Sam Alvey at middleweight. Julian Marquez, you'll probably remember him as the guy that won his last fight, and then during his post-fight interview asked Miley Cyrus to be his Valentine, and she responded on Twitter, so that was pretty fun. We'll be back next week. We're going to look at Zhang Weili versus Rose Namajunas for the women's strawweight championship. Not that I don't want to talk about the upcoming Whitaker-Gastelum fight next week, but I'd like to take a look at both Zhang versus Rose and then Valentina Shevchenko versus Jessica Andrade the week after for UFC 261. So the next 2 episodes are going to be women's championships fights. If you want to keep up with me during the week, you can also find me on Twitter at Fights We Love. Like I said, I'm going to be trying to post a couple clips that I talked about from this week's episode and show some actual cool examples that I found throughout the week when I was watching film. And oh, by the way, we've also got Usman Masvidal 2 coming up on UFC 261. So lots of great fights coming up in the coming weeks. Once again, I'm Alex O, and hopefully you enjoyed this week's episode. I appreciate you tuning in, so enjoy the fights this weekend and come back next week and we'll talk about the fights we love. Thank you for listening.